The Imperium of Man is an uncompromising thing toward those both beyond and within its own borders. Its xenophobia is legendary, and even the slightest genetic deviation within humanity is a source of fear and derision, and occasionally, actually more than occasionally, execution. At the same time, the rule of imperial law is absolute. Every planet has its own laws defined by culture and such, but there are still overarching rules that all of the Emperor's subjects are bound by. When it comes to the enforcement of these laws, only the highest ranked, almost influential of all can even claim trial. Instead, the roles of judge, jury, and executioner are all handled by an individual within one of the many organizations of the Adeptus Terra. With its origins in the Great Crusade, this organization is now effectively the official Imperial police, with brutal warriors who enforce the harsh law of humanity in the most final way possible. Led by one of the High Lords of Terra known as the Grand Provost Marshal, they are known simply as the Adeptus Arbites, and this is what we know of them and the laws they uphold. This is Tactica Imperialis, and welcome to 40k Stories. The Adeptus Arbites as an organisation has been around since the Great Crusade, though when they were officially founded exactly is unknown. At the time, as today, it seemed to be an extension of planetary law that would deal with overarching matters considered non-local. What that in essence means is that everyday law enforcement is not and was not truly the remit of the Arbites. That still falls to the local police of the planet itself, which can have its own legal system rather than using a copy-paste universal imperial one. However, there is still said universal system, though how much of it was around in the Great Crusade era I would be curious to see, as it has had over 10,000 years to evolve with lots of different authors. It is this system, known as the Lex Imperialis, that the Arbites will enforce, usually with the business end of some sort of lethal weapon, but we'll get to that later. Back in the Crusade, it is stated that worlds brought to compliance had what was known as a Lord Marshal's office built or otherwise created upon them. This was the headquarters for the Arbites on that world, and the name of the building implied that it answered to someone higher up, as a Lord Marshal today can potentially oversee an entire sector. Terra itself was no exception to this rule, as they fell under the direct remit of the Emperor, which only makes sense given everyone save the Assassinorum was back then. The overall leadership of the Arbites was based on the cradle of humanity, and so there was a not insignificant number of them there. Said leader was, and still is, an individual known as the Grand Provost Marshal, who was not on the original War Council of the Great Crusade, but who was a member of the Civilian Council of Terra following its inception after the Triumph of Volanor. The Grand Provost Marshal has actually retained this role in its newer form today, as they are always a permanent member of the Senatorum Imperialis, partially as a legal advisor to other High Lords and an individual with a keen eye for Terran politics. Though we lack details, it is assumed that the Arbites were heavily involved in the Horus Heresy on the small, local scale. After all, if word happened to spread of the massive Imperial Civil War going on, of course many worlds or elements of them would take the opportunity to rise up, try and overthrow the Imperial authorities. This would mean that the Arbites would have to put these riots down as best they could, and though they would likely have not stood a chance against the renegade Imperial army force, or of course the traitor Astartes legions, I suspect they likely did a very good job otherwise, as at least if things were like they are now, their bases would have been able to support an entire army. After the heresy, it seems as though things didn't change that much for the Arbites in terms of structure or function, something of a rarity at the time given what happened to the Astartes, the Imperial Army, and even the Council of Terra. If they hadn't been placed there already, history gets a little vague regarding foundings and structures sometimes, the Arbites were placed under the umbrella of the Adeptus Terra. They would also come to work somewhat closely with the Adeptus Ministorum following the rise of the ecclesiarchy, since like many imperial organisations, they used them for recruitment purposes. But one thing has been pretty much constant from day one to now. If you fancy staying alive, don't mess with the Arbites. Since we are talking about its enforcers, I think it is only fair we also discuss the Lex Imperialis itself, since it's kind of the raison d'etre for the existence of the Arbites. Also known as the Dictates Imperialis, it was originally compiled by the Emperor most likely as the basic laws of the Imperium. Though every world could have its own laws and legal system, the Dictates overruled all. However, in the millennia following the internment of the Emperor, it has been added to seemingly without end by the Senatorum Imperialis that rules in his stead. Since the first entries were of course the actual word of the Emperor, and the High Lords now rule on his behalf, the Lex Imperialis is treated in its entirety as the Emperor's word, and thus it cannot be overruled and it cannot be contravened. I'm actually curious what lies within especially the original volumes, as the Emperor may well have encoded the non-religious doctrines of the original Imperium into the Lex Imperialis, which would make things rather awkward given the way the Imperium is today. If there is a conflict, mind you, I'd not be surprised. The full document containing the Lex Imperialis, known as the Book of Judgment, is thousands of volumes long, if not even more, and they say that 100 new volumes are added to it every single day. This means that there are conflicts that are bound to show up, either in exact wording or interpretations therein by the members of the Arbites assigned to larger cases. Add in the various rulings that have been made that may not agree with one another, and things get even more confusing. The more complex cases are able to go on for centuries, passed from judge to judge, who will dedicate their whole lives to just one case, and punishing people generations down the line. Admittedly, this doesn't need to happen all that often, as quite often an individual member of the Arbites will be an on-the-spot judge, jury, and executioner. Many of them carry a condensed, field-portable version of the Book of Judgment known as the Book of Laws, and it is said that reading from it can cause fear in the hearts of those who do wrong. I assume thus that Arbites are often decent orators, or the Book of Laws says some utterly terrifying things. Actually, this is the Imperium, it's probably the latter. When they encounter a crime that falls within their remit, they will act swiftly and uncompromisingly, hunting down and punishing those responsible. Though we don't have percentages, I suspect that the amount of individuals executed by the Arbites versus those arrested is a not insignificant amount, perhaps it's even the majority. Even those arrested likely don't have that long a life expectancy. As stated, the Arbites are judge, jury, and executioner, and once their interrogations are complete, I suspect a bolt round, a shotgun shell, or perhaps placement in a penal legion will often be a chosen punishment, and if the penal legion isn't much better than a shotgun shell, well, to be honest, you're going to live about 5 minutes longer anyway once you get into the battlefield. This will, if not administered on the spot, be done in the courthouse, the new name for Arbites bases that are effectively mini fortresses equipped with armories, libraries, and more that are generally designed to be completely self-sufficient for an army of Arbites and their vehicle pool. You may be wondering to yourself whether anyone can claim trial for their supposed crimes, and the answer is, to put a long story short, well, no. In the eyes of the Arbites, citizens have no rights. At all. Not even if they're a planetary governor, high-ranking official, whatever, don't care. The only ones who can claim trial are members of the Ecclesiarchy or the Inquisition, though technically Inquisitors are kind of above the law anyway, so I'm curious how that little interaction plays out. If you're wondering why it's them in particular, consider that the Ecclesiarchy and Inquisition are separate organisations to the Adeptus Terra, and thus don't fall under the Adeptus Terra, and thus the Arbites' remit. However, the Arbites have a second task, perhaps their most important depending on how you view the Imperium. Whilst law enforcement and hunting down enemies are of course very, very important, the Arbites are also charged with ensuring that the planetary governors pay their world's tithes on time, probably their most common duty on most worlds. This, combined with their brutal intervention in case of rebellion or other threats to imperial rule, means that said planetary governors are completely not keen on the Adeptus Arbites, but they're forced to tolerate them. Does that just sound to me like a metaphor for life in the Imperium for some people? Might just be me thinking that. The Arbites are organised and equipped very simply, but very effectively, especially in terms of their war gear, which we'll get to soon. As mentioned earlier, the Grand Provost Marshal is the overall leader of the organisation, sitting on the High Lords of Terror and based from the Hall of Judgment, a now massive complex on Terra containing the entire Book of Judgment and a place that all judges of the Arbites will attempt to pilgrimage to in their lifetimes. However, the Grand Provost Marshal does not generally oversee the day-to-day running of the Arbites, instead interesting themselves more in the politics of Terra than those who work below them. The more daily management is instead handled by Marshals of the Court, who oversee what are known as precincts. How many there are and thus how large they are is sadly unknown, but they will be tasked with the management of all Arbites within their sphere of influence. Below the Marshals of the Court, there are two main subgroups within the Arbites, though each of those in turn have subdivisions too. The larger of the two is likely the Arbitrators, the main fighting force of the Arbites, recruited from the Ministorum Schola Progenium and thus fanatically loyal to the Emperor and their task of punishing the Imperium's lawbreakers. These are also the typical Arbites that you'd think of when you imagine them. Though the most common rank is that of the Trooper, which implies in turn their role as an army should that be needed, there are several ranks within the Arbitrators and several roles they can fulfill. There are divisions assigned to espionage and covert ops, interrogation specialists, even forensic experts and cybercrime experts for crying out loud. The Mechanicus also devote a few members to the Arbites, acting as handlers for the cybermastiffs I'll discuss in a minute as part of their equipment. Of course, the Arbitrators are undoubtedly best known for the shock troops who act as riot control, or the suffering marshals who hunt down and execute fugitive targets, or the patrol groups who are often found in the dangerous sections of hives, likely administering a beatdown to any who they feel deserve it. More famous, though less numerous, are the judges, selected from the most promising of the Arbitrators and, in some ways, like fairer versions of Inquisitors. They will be the most knowledgeable of Arbites on a given world, being well versed in the law they will need to prosecute as far as anyone can be given the mess that is the Lex Imperialis. They are also capable warriors all, having originally been arbitrators, and they are more than able to fight or deal out their chosen punishment to the guilty. However, they do not kill indiscriminately nor unjustly, as they will always bear the law in mind before they pass judgment. Their reach is borderline absolute, as none within the Adeptus Terra seem to fall outside of their remit. As mentioned, the Inquisition and the Ecclesiarchy do play by their own rules, or at the very least get a trial. They will lead Arbites armies in battle should the situation arise, with enough skill to put down a rebellion or hold the line against a superior force until other Imperials can arrive to help them. When not on the battlefield or otherwise presiding cases, it is common for a judge to make a pilgrimage to Terra and its Hall of Judgment. There they may well stay, trying to solve a case assigned to them that may not be resolved within their lifetime, or at least until the original transgressor is long since dead. Senior judges are known as magistrates, who not only know the Lex Imperialis as their peers do, but also know local laws well too. Whether this means they're involved in more complex cases of their planet or system's legal system is unclear, but I doubt it somehow unless it has a real effect on their own case. This extra experience will see the magistrates assigned the most difficult of cases, often revolving around heresy amongst other things, and thus requiring an incredibly loyal individual who would be difficult to corrupt in the cases of the very worst ones. In terms of equipment, the Arbites are far better equipped than the Astra Militarum, though of course their lack of numbers and the way they work means their influence only goes so far. The standard issue for an arbitrator will usually consist of a carapace armour with extra headgear, whilst for weapons it can range from shotguns to grenade launchers to mauls and a unique shield that electrocutes those it hits. Judges are very similarly equipped, though their unique judge armour will have an extra aesthetic element to it, even if it may be no better for protection. They will also make extensive use of technology outside of their armour and weapons, including a varied vehicle pool that draws from both Astartes and Astra Militarum. The Arbites, in fact, were the original users of the Repressor, a modified Rhino with additional firing ports originally designed for riot control, hence the name. However, the Adeptus Arbites borrowed and then modified the tank somewhat, and now they're able to use it in their own armies too. On top of their transport, the Arbites make use of automated turrets that work for both defense or control, as well as the cybermastiffs I mentioned earlier. As far as I can tell, these are not bionically augmented canines for the most part, though such a thing can happen, but instead they appear to be pure machines enhanced by the brains and nervous systems of other hunters. They aren't exactly intelligent, but they are loyal and vicious, chasing down any who try to flee the long arm of the Imperium's law. Interestingly, the Arbites also maintain their own small fleet of spacebound vessels rather than jumping on civilian ships or ones belonging to other Imperial organizations. Though relatively few and not necessarily the best armed compared to their peers, an Arbites fleet can still pack a punch against a rebel fleet or get more troops into a particularly dangerous area in some safety. Basically, if you think of the Arbites as a small but elite standing army on every Imperial world, you wouldn't be too far off of correct in your perception of them if you just add in a spin of law enforcement. Some members of the Adeptus Arbites have managed to win a fair amount of renown or infamy in their days, and we shall look at them before we finish up. The first of them I wish to discuss are the best known of the Grand Provost Marshals, one from the ancient era and one from the modern age. The former was Grand Provost Marshal during the War of the Beast, a heavily modified individual known as Vernor Zek. With information fed directly into his bionic brain, Zek was capable of processing vast amounts of information, and it seemed to show in the intelligence of his decisions throughout the War of the Beast. He was amongst the first to support the removal of the Imperium's Lord Commander at the time of the war, a former or current Lord High Admiral of the Navy, in favour of Courland of the Imperial Fists. A wise move, as said Admiral had been utterly incompetent, blame-shifting, and even trying to chastise the Space Marines for their heroics. Once that was over, Zek stayed true to the Courland-backing course of action, being one of very few to support the execution of the Ecclesiarch and the sanctioning of the Ministorum. Whether this was the smartest call is unclear, but given the former Ecclesiarch was ranting for the Imperials to surrender to the Beast, I can certainly understand why the lawman wouldn't want them on the Senatorum. He would unfortunately meet his end by the actions of the tyrannical master of assassins Draken Vangerich, who set Venom assassin Isad Wire on him when he conducted his coup, known as the Beheading. However, Wire had actually served as an arbitrator between his time in the Venom Temple and this point, and though he followed through on the execution of Zek, he agreed with the Grand Provost Marshal that Vangerich was in fact the traitor and only slew Zek, who put up a damn good fight, to maintain the confidence of the Master of Assassins. In more recent times, perhaps the current serving Grand Provost Marshal is Avaliza Drakmar, who was the representative of the Arbites during the 13th Black Crusade. Unfortunately, we know little to nothing of them beside their placement and their stubbornness, as they were one of the opponents to the dissolution of the Custodes' vows that confined them to Terra. Originally proposed by Lev Tiernan, Chancellor of the Senatorum and the first of them to meet the returned Robert Guilliman, this dissolution was eventually passed to allow the Custodians to join the Crusades and battles beyond the cradle of humanity. But whether Drakmar remains Grand Provost Marshal today remains to be seen as time has passed and things can change. Perhaps her stubbornness got her replaced. We don't know. Though he wasn't a Grand Provost Marshal, or perhaps even a Marshal of the Court, Judge Auric von Darnus has perhaps proved to be one of the more controversial Arbites members, at least amongst their own ranks. Based in the Calixis sector sometime during M40, von Darnus became rather infamous throughout his career, though it is his work later in life that caused such controversy. Turning to study and writing, he began to analyse the Lex Imperialis in depth, before publishing a book of his own that called for a shift in focus of the Arbites, with treason and sedition being a higher priority than supposedly lesser crimes. This, unsurprisingly, drew some amount of critique, and as time has gone on, some have even accused the judge of religious bias or even of being a tool of the ecclesiarchy. Whether this is true is unknown, since von Darnus is now long since dead, but he still has his fans, most notably Lord Marshal Luthor Verum Gorman. Gorman is one of these success stories of the Arbites, I suppose. He was converted to the cause despite leading a life of crime by a former arbitrator turned confessor that he actually kidnapped. He started at the bottom but worked his way up, rising to command of the precinct fortress on Scintilla, capital world of the Calixis sector. This effectively, along with a further promotion to the rank of Lord Marshal, gives him command of all Arbites within the sector, Whether he ranks as a Marshal of the Court is unclear, especially given the sector's size, but he still wields a not insignificant amount of authority regardless. He has also overseen the creation of a task force called the Divisio Imperialis that is charged with hunting down cults and such. Why he had to be the one to make this up in M41, I have no idea, given how much sense it makes to institute it since, well, basically day one, but there you go. To conclude, let's jump back to the War of the Beast and an individual involved in the Proletarian Crusade, perhaps the stupidest of ideas the Imperium has ever had. Simply put, it involved trying to land a massive civilian militia on the Orc attack moon over Terra with little to no support from actually trained troops like Guardsmen or Arbites. However, some Arbites were involved, including but not limited to Galatea Haas. Haas was actually convinced to join the crusade by one of her colleagues in the Arbites, despite believing initially that her duty meant she should remain on Terra. Suffice it to say, however, the crusade went really, really badly. The citizen army did land in some numbers, mainly due to being too numerous to shoot down, and Haas was one of those lucky few to make it. At which point her super enthusiastic colleague effectively bottled it and had to be executed for cowardice by a commissar. Unfortunately, the Orcs, through methods I doubt anyone understands, were able to manipulate and then create tectonic hell upon the attack moon, killing almost all the humans landed upon it. Haas was somehow not killed, but was enslaved by the Orcs, though somewhat sheltered by abhumans known as Longshanks. She would finally be saved when the Imperium got their act together, as the Black Templars and other Imperial Fist successors from the last wall stormed the attack moon. Though the abhumans were slain by the Black Templars, Haas was saved and eventually reinstated to her post on Terra. She would then kind of get promoted to Grand Provost Marshal. Kind of. Since Zek was now very dead following the beheading, Vangerich needed someone to take the Arbite's seat on the Senatorum as a proxy, and he chose Haas. Of course, Vangerich was basically running a puppet government, so I doubt she had much to do, but it's still a thing that happened. Whether she was in any trouble after the deposition of Vangerich is another story, sadly one we don't have, I'm afraid, so she may have stayed on as Grand Provost Marshal, or she may have been chucked out for serving under Vangerich. We just don't know. So end the tales of the Adeptus Arbites. The long arm of Imperial law has an incredible reach, and it is through the investigations and actions of the Arbites that they stay enforced on every world. Fanatically loyal, they are extremely well-trained and equipped warriors, yet they are fair, if extremely firm, in their deeds. Sure, you may have no rights or defence should you cross them, but if you stick within the laws of the Imperium, which is no small feat I suppose given their convoluted nature, you have nothing to fear from the Arbites. Well, probably. Now it is time to move on, and I have something a little different planned. You see, all this galaxy and dimension hopping I've been doing means I've seen a not small amount of it. So what I thought I'd do is explain how the galaxy is organised in the Imperium's eyes, as well as going over some of the more recent developments that have changed the way it looks, and even maybe giving you a bit of a history and geography lesson for what you can expect to find. For now though, thank you for watching Tactica Imperialis, and I'll see you all again. Goodbye.